The sound of splintering wood echoed through the quiet suburban street as the front door burst open. Red and blue lights painted the white walls of the Thompson home in violent streaks, casting dancing shadows across family photographs that would soon be scattered on the floor. 8-year-old Maya's screams pierced the midnight air as uniformed officers yanked her from her bed, her small hands reaching desperately for her foster mother, who was being held back by 2 more officers. "Mommy! Mommy! Help me!" Maya's voice cracked with terror, her stuffed elephant falling forgotten to the hardwood floor. Sarah Thompson fought against the officer's grip, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Please, you're scaring her. Let me show you the papers. The custody documents, she's legally in our care." But the officers weren't listening. They moved with mechanical efficiency, following a script that had been set in motion by a single phone call 47 minutes earlier. In the chaos, 12-year-old Marcus was being pulled from his room, his face a mask of stoic determination, even as tears streamed down his cheeks. He'd been in the system long enough to know that fighting only made things worse. The nightmare had begun 3 hours before Maya's screams shattered the peace of Maple Street. The Thompson family had been preparing for bed after their first Thanksgiving together as a complete family unit. Sarah, a social worker herself, had spent months navigating the bureaucratic maze to bring Maya and Marcus into their home. Her husband David, a high school teacher, had transformed their spare room into a warm, welcoming space filled with books and toys carefully chosen to help the children feel safe. The house had been filled with laughter that evening. Maya had helped Sarah arrange fall leaves they'd collected that afternoon into a centerpiece for their dining table, while Marcus and David worked on a puzzle featuring the solar system. The smell of pumpkin pie still lingered in the kitchen, mixing with the vanilla candles Sarah had lit to make their home feel extra cozy. It was the kind of evening Sarah had dreamed of when she first decided to become a foster parent. "Can we watch one more movie?" Maya had asked, her eyes bright with the kind of trust that only comes when a child finally feels secure. "It's already past bedtime, sweetheart," Sarah had replied, brushing Maya's curly hair behind her ear. "But tomorrow we can watch whatever you want while we make our Christmas wish lists." Marcus had looked up from his book, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Really, even cartoons?" "Especially cartoons." David had chimed in, ruffling the boy's hair. "I happen to be an expert on Saturday morning cartoons." But their neighbor Karen Hendricks had been watching through her kitchen window. Her lips pursed in disapproval as she observed the interracial family's evening routine. Karen, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a perpetual bun, had made her opinions about the Thompson family crystal clear since the children's arrival 3 months earlier. She'd cornered Sarah at the mailbox multiple times, her voice dripping with false concern as she questioned whether the children were really safe in their care. "I'm just saying, it's unusual," Karen had insisted during one particularly uncomfortable encounter. "A white family taking in those children? People might get the wrong idea." Sarah had tried to remain diplomatic, explaining that she and David had been certified foster parents for over a year and that all proper procedures had been followed. But Karen's expression had remained skeptical, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she watched Maya and Marcus play in the backyard. That Thanksgiving night, as Karen peered through her blinds at the warm light spilling from the Thompson home, something inside her snapped. She'd watched David carry a sleepy Maya upstairs, while Sarah helped Marcus gather his homework supplies. To Karen's twisted perspective, the scene looked wrong, suspicious, threatening to the carefully maintained order of her predominantly white neighborhood. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, her voice taking on a breathless quality as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I need to report a situation next door. I think there might be human trafficking going on. There are children, black children, and I've never seen any official paperwork. The man who lives there, he's always touching them, picking them up. It doesn't look right. I think those children might be in danger. The dispatcher, trained to take all reports seriously, asked for details. Karen embellished freely, describing late-night crying she claimed to have heard, strangers coming and going at odd hours, and her general suspicion that something criminal was happening under the cover of a fake family arrangement. "I've been watching for months," Karen continued, her voice gaining confidence as she spun her web of lies. "I know what trafficking looks like. These people are using those children for something terrible." The gravity of trafficking allegations triggered an immediate response protocol. Within 20 minutes, police cars were speeding toward Maple Street, their drivers briefed on a potential child endangerment situation involving suspected trafficking. The officers had no way of knowing that their intelligence came from a woman whose only evidence was her own prejudice and paranoia. The first wave of officers arrived silently, positioning themselves around the Thompson home, while additional units approached from the rear. The house was dark, except for a few security lights, the family having retired for the evening after their peaceful Thanksgiving celebration. Lead Officer Martinez, a veteran with 15 years of experience, felt the familiar knot in his stomach that accompanied high-stakes domestic calls. In his experience, trafficking situations often involved desperate people willing to do anything to avoid capture. The battering ram struck the door with devastating force, the sound exploding through the quiet house like a gunshot. Sarah and David bolted upright in bed, their hearts hammering as they tried to process what was happening. The sound of heavy boots on their hardwood floors sent ice through Sarah's veins as she reached for her robe. "Police, everyone on the ground now." David moved toward the bedroom door, his hands raised, trying to make sense of the chaos erupting in his home. "There must be some mistake. We have children here. They're sleeping." But the officers were already moving through the house with tactical precision, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched each room. When they reached Maya's bedroom, the little girl was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched her stuffed elephant to her chest. "It's okay, sweetheart," Officer Johnson said, his voice softer than his colleagues. "We're here to help you. Can you come with me?" Maya shook her head frantically, pressing herself against the headboard. "I want my mommy. Where's Sarah? I want Sarah." When the officer reached for her, Maya's screams began in earnest, her small body trembling as she was lifted from her bed. Her cries echoed through the house, mixing with Marcus's shouts from the next room as he was similarly removed from his bed. The boy had been through this before in his previous placement, and the familiar terror of being torn from safety crashed over him like a tidal wave. Sarah fought desperately to reach her children, her voice breaking as she called out reassurances she couldn't possibly keep. "Maya, it's going to be okay, Marcus. I'm right here. We're going to fix this." Officer Martinez was beginning to have doubts about the operation as he watched the genuine distress of what appeared to be a loving family. But protocols demanded that suspected trafficking victims be immediately removed from potentially dangerous situations. The children would be taken to emergency care while the investigation proceeded, regardless of how authentic the family's emotional responses appeared. "Ma'am, you need to provide any documentation regarding these children," Martinez told Sarah as she was restrained in the living room. "Custody papers, foster care agreements, anything official." "They're upstairs in my office, the filing cabinet by the window." Sarah sobbed, watching helplessly as Maya and Marcus were carried toward the front door. "Please, just look at the papers. We have all the legal documentation." But the officers were focused on securing the scene and removing the children to safety. The paperwork could be reviewed later, once everyone was separated and the immediate threat, if any, was neutralized. Within minutes, Maya and Marcus were placed in separate police vehicles, their faces pressed against the windows as they watched their home disappear into the darkness. The emergency placement facility was a stark government building that smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair. Maya was placed in a room with 3 other girls, none of whom spoke English as their first language. She curled up on the thin mattress, clutching her elephant and whimpering for Sarah, until exhaustion finally claimed her. In another wing of the building, Marcus sat on his assigned bed with his arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the institutional green walls and fighting the familiar feeling that safety was always temporary, always an illusion. Back at the Thompson home, Sarah and David were being questioned separately while investigators combed through their house, searching for any evidence that might support the trafficking allegations. The couple's shock and grief were palpable, but the officers had learned to be skeptical of emotional displays that might be performance rather than genuine distress. "How long have you had custody of these children?" Detective Williams asked Sarah, her pen poised over a notebook filled with details that would determine the family's fate. 3 months officially, but we've been working toward adoption for over a year," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from crying. "I'm a social worker myself. I know exactly what legal requirements need to be met. All our paperwork is current and properly filed with the state." In David's interview, he provided a detailed timeline of their foster care certification process, including the background checks, home inspections, and training sessions they'd completed. His answers were consistent and detailed, matching Sarah's account in every particular. The investigators were beginning to recognize that they might be dealing with a false report, but the wheels of bureaucracy had already been set in motion. The documentation review took 6 hours. Every form was scrutinized, every signature verified, every date cross-referenced with state records. By dawn, it was clear that the Thompson family was not only legitimate, but exemplary in their compliance with foster care regulations. Maya and Marcus were legally placed children who had been thriving in their care, making excellent progress in school and showing none of the behavioral indicators typically associated with abuse or trafficking. Detective Williams delivered the news to Sarah and David with obvious embarrassment. "I'm sorry to say that it appears you were the victims of a false report. Your documentation is impeccable, and we can find no evidence whatsoever to support the allegations that were made." "Where are my children?" Sarah demanded, her exhaustion replaced by fierce maternal rage. "How soon can we get them back? They've been traumatized enough without spending another minute in that facility." But reunification, they learned, wouldn't be immediate. Child Protective Services needed to conduct their own investigation, despite the police findings. The children would remain in emergency care for at least another 24 hours, while social workers reviewed the case file and conducted interviews with Maya and Marcus to ensure they felt safe returning to the Thompson home. The next 36 hours were the longest of Sarah and David's lives. They called their attorney, contacted their state representative, and reached out to every professional connection they had in the child welfare system. The house felt impossibly empty without Maya's laughter and Marcus's quiet presence. Sarah found herself standing in their bedrooms, touching their clothes and toys, fighting waves of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm her. Meanwhile, Maya had stopped eating entirely, refusing to speak to anyone except to ask when Sarah was coming to get her. Marcus had retreated into himself, answering questions in monosyllables and staring at the wall with the 1,000-yard stare of a child who had learned not to hope too hard for good things to last. The CPS social worker, Janet Rodriguez, recognized immediately that these were children who had been thriving in a loving environment and were now showing clear signs of separation trauma. Her interviews with Maya and Marcus left no doubt about their attachment to Sarah and David or their desire to return home. "Sarah makes the best pancakes," Maya whispered when asked about her foster mother, tears streaming down her face. "She reads me stories, and she promised we could make Christmas cookies. When can I go home?" Marcus was less forthcoming, but when pressed about his feelings of safety in the Thompson home, his composure cracked. "They were going to adopt us. Sarah said we could be a real family forever. Did they change their minds? Is that why we're here?" Janet's report was unequivocal. The children were being returned to their foster family immediately, and an investigation would be opened into the source of the false allegations that had caused this traumatic separation. But even as the bureaucratic wheels turned toward resolution, the damage had been done. The sense of safety and security that Sarah and David had worked so hard to build had been shattered in a single night. The reunion at the CPS office was heart-wrenching. Maya launched herself into Sarah's arms, sobbing as if her heart would break, while Marcus stood frozen until David knelt down and opened his arms. The boy walked into the embrace slowly, as if afraid it might be another trick, another false promise of security. "I thought you didn't want me anymore," Marcus whispered against David's shoulder. "Never," David replied fiercely. "We will never stop wanting you. You are our son, and nothing will ever change that." But going home wasn't the end of their ordeal. Maya began having nightmares, waking up screaming for Sarah in the middle of the night, convinced that the officers were coming back to take her away. Marcus became hypervigilant, flinching at every unexpected sound and asking repeatedly if they were in trouble, if someone was going to make them leave again. Sarah threw herself into researching their legal options, determined to ensure that whoever had made the false report would face consequences. The police were initially reluctant to pursue charges, suggesting that the caller might have genuinely believed they were witnessing suspicious activity. But Sarah's fury was righteous and unstoppable. "Someone deliberately destroyed my children's sense of security," she told Detective Williams during a heated phone conversation. "They weaponized the system that's supposed to protect children and used it to traumatize mine. That's not a mistake. That's a crime." David, meanwhile, had been doing detective work of his own. He reviewed their home security camera footage from the night of Thanksgiving, looking for any clues about what might have triggered such a violent response from law enforcement. What he found made his blood run cold. The cameras clearly showed Karen Hendricks standing at her kitchen window, watching their family's evening routine with obvious agitation. She'd been on the phone for nearly 20 minutes, gesturing toward their house as she spoke. The timestamp showed that her call had ended just 47 minutes before the police arrived. "It was Karen," David told Sarah, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She called in a false report because she doesn't like seeing our family together." The evidence was damning, but proving malicious intent would require more than security footage. Sarah contacted a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases involving racial discrimination and false reporting. Attorney Maria Santos took one look at the case file and agreed to represent the family pro bono. This is exactly the kind of weaponization of law enforcement that we're seeing more and more often. Santos explained during their first meeting. People use their assumptions and prejudices to turn police into instruments of harassment against families of color. It has to stop. The legal battle would be long and difficult, but Sarah and David were committed to pursuing justice not just for their family, but for all the families who might become Karen's next targets. They began documenting everything: Maya's therapy sessions, Marcus's regression in school, the family's ongoing trauma, and the thousands of dollars in legal fees and counseling costs they were accumulating. As word of their ordeal spread through their community, an unexpected groundswell of support began to emerge. Their neighbors on Maple Street, many of whom had been quiet witnesses to Karen's increasingly erratic behavior, came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The picture that emerged was of a woman whose prejudices had been festering for years, finally erupting into an act of shocking cruelty. Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down revealed that Karen had questioned her about her legal status when she first moved to the neighborhood. Despite Mrs. Chen being a third-generation American citizen, the Rodriguez family at the corner had been subjected to complaints about their children playing in their own backyard, with Karen insisting that the noise was disturbing the neighborhood's character. She told me that our kind of people were lowering property values. Roberto Rodriguez shared during a community meeting that Sarah and David organized. I thought it was just ignorant talk, but now I see it was something much more dangerous. The story reached local media when Maya's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, contacted a journalist friend about the little girl's dramatic change in behavior. Maya had gone from being a bright, confident student to a withdrawn child who jumped at sudden noises and asked repeatedly if she was going to be taken away again. Channel 7 News picked up the story, and reporter Jennifer Walsh's investigation revealed disturbing patterns in how false reports were handled by local law enforcement. The Thompson case became a rallying point for advocates demanding better protocols to prevent the weaponization of child welfare systems against minority families. The media attention brought both support and additional scrutiny to the family. Sarah found herself thrust into the role of reluctant activist, speaking at community forums and policy meetings about the need for reform. David struggled with the public nature of their private trauma, but recognized that their visibility might protect other families from similar ordeals. Every time I see Maya wake up screaming, Sarah told the packed auditorium at a town hall meeting, I think about how many other children have gone through this because someone decided their family didn't look right. We can't let this continue. The pressure on law enforcement and the district attorney's office intensified as civil rights organizations joined the campaign for justice. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People opened an investigation into discriminatory practices in emergency response protocols. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a formal complaint alleging constitutional violations in the handling of the Thompson case. Karen Hendricks, meanwhile, had retreated into her house as the community's anger focused on her actions. Reporters had identified her as the source of the false report, and her neighbors' testimonies about her pattern of discriminatory behavior had made her a pariah on her own street. Real estate agents began receiving calls from residents wanting to distance themselves from association with her. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed a woman consumed by racial resentment and paranoia about changing neighborhood demographics. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the court-appointed psychologist, described Karen as exhibiting signs of delusional thinking specifically related to minority families and their right to live in her community. Ms. Hendricks appears to believe that she is protecting her neighborhood from invasion by people she considers undesirable. Dr. Harper testified during the preliminary hearing. Her actions were not the result of genuine concern for child welfare, but rather an attempt to use law enforcement to remove a family she found objectionable. The charges against Karen were serious: filing a false police report, harassment, reckless endangerment of minors, and a hate crime enhancement due to the racial motivation underlying her actions. Each charge carried potential jail time and substantial fines. But more importantly, they sent a message that weaponizing emergency services against minority families would face real consequences. Karen's attorney attempted to argue that she had genuinely believed she was witnessing suspicious activity, but the security footage and witness testimony painted a clear picture of malicious intent. Her own words, recorded by the 911 system, revealed assumptions and language that exposed her underlying prejudices. The trial became a media sensation, with national news outlets covering what they termed a landmark case in the fight against discriminatory false reporting. Legal scholars debated the implications for both civil rights and emergency response protocols. The courtroom was packed each day with supporters of the Thompson family and advocates for criminal justice reform. Maya and Marcus didn't testify directly, but their therapy records were admitted as evidence of the trauma they had suffered. Child psychologist Dr. Jennifer Kim described the lasting impact of their separation from their foster family, including Maya's persistent nightmares and Marcus's regression in academic and social development. The children's sense of safety and attachment was severely damaged. Dr. Kim testified. They had finally found stability after years of uncertainty, only to have it violently disrupted by someone's prejudiced assumptions. The psychological scars may take years to heal. Sarah's testimony was the emotional climax of the trial. She described the terror of watching her children being torn from their beds, the agonizing hours of separation, and the ongoing struggle to rebuild their sense of security. Her voice remained steady until she spoke about Maya's first night home, when the little girl had refused to sleep in her own room for fear that the officers would come back. "She slept on our floor for 2 months," Sarah said, her composure finally breaking. "Every night, she would check the locks 3 times and ask if we were sure no one was coming to take her away. That's what false reporting does to a child. It steals their ability to feel safe." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Karen was sentenced to 18 months in jail, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the family's therapy costs and legal fees, which totaled more than $50,000. But perhaps more importantly, the case resulted in systemic changes to how emergency calls were processed and investigated. The police department implemented new protocols requiring supervisors to review trafficking allegations before authorizing nighttime raids. The district attorney's office created a special unit to prosecute false reports motivated by bias or discrimination. The Thompson family's ordeal had lasted nearly 8 months from the initial raid to Karen's sentencing, but they had emerged stronger and more committed to protecting other families from similar trauma. Sarah accepted a position with a nonprofit organization focused on preventing the weaponization of child welfare systems, while David began speaking at police training seminars about the impact of false reports on innocent families. Maya and Marcus slowly began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, though Maya still insisted on keeping a small nightlight on and checking the door locks before bed. Marcus's grades improved, and he began talking about college and his dreams of becoming a teacher like David. The adoption proceedings, which had been suspended during the investigation, were finally completed on a sunny Thursday morning in June. "Are we really a family now?" Maya asked the judge as she signed the final papers. "Sweetheart, you've been a family all along," Judge Patricia Morrison replied with a warm smile. "Now it's just official." The community that had rallied around the Thompson family during their darkest hours became like extended family to them. The annual block party on Maple Street became a celebration of diversity and unity, with neighbors sharing foods from their various cultural backgrounds and children playing together regardless of the color of their skin or the origins of their families. Karen's house stood empty for months after her incarceration, a stark reminder of where hatred and prejudice could lead. Eventually, it was purchased by a young immigrant family from Somalia. their 3 children soon adding their laughter to the sounds of the neighborhood. The irony was not lost on anyone who had lived through the events that had torn apart the peace of their small community. On the first anniversary of the raid, Sarah and David held a quiet ceremony in their backyard, lighting candles for all the children who had been traumatized by systems meant to protect them. Maya and Marcus, now legally their children forever, stood beside them as they pledged to continue fighting for justice and reform. "We can't change what happened to us," Sarah said to the gathered crowd of neighbors and advocates, "but we can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. That's how we honor the pain we've all endured." Maya, now 9 years old and growing more confident each day, stepped forward to speak for the first time at one of their public events. Her voice was small, but clear as she addressed the crowd. "I used to be scared that people would take me away from my real family," she said, reaching for Sarah's hand. "But now I know that love is stronger than scared, and good people always help when bad things happen. My mommy and daddy taught me that." The applause was thunderous, but Maya barely noticed. She was looking up at Sarah and David, her eyes bright with the unshakable confidence that only comes when a child knows, beyond any doubt, that they are home forever. The trauma would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined their future. They had survived the worst that prejudice and hatred could inflict, and they had emerged victorious, their bonds stronger than ever. As the sun set behind their house on Maple Street, the Thompson family walked inside together, closing the door on the past and opening their hearts to all the possibilities that lay ahead. They had learned that justice, though sometimes delayed, was not denied to those brave enough to demand it. And in a world that could still be cruel to families that dared to be different, that knowledge was perhaps the greatest victory of all.